Well, thank you so much for being here with us. It's so exciting to be here sharing our results of our year-long research. Our project is titled From Surviving to Thriving, Building a Blueprint for Equity-Focused Housing Initiatives in Colorado's Rural Resort Communities. This project is part of the Bell Policy Inaugural Fellowship focused on economic mobility. And my colleagues and I chose the project on housing and as it relates to economic mobility. I'll get started by sharing, I'm going on to the next slide, and sharing a little bit about our team. My name is Yesenia Silva Estrada. I'm currently the Vice President of Planning and Chief of Staff at Colorado Mountain College. But one of the reasons why I was so compelled to be part of this research and focused on housing is because I've grown up in our rural resort mountain communities. I grew up in Carbondale and went through all of my schooling there. And now that I'm an adult and I've been able to acquire an education and have the opportunity to progress through my career, even though I've had that opportunity, I have not been able to afford to live where I grew up. I now live in Silt, which is twice the amount of distance from our closest mountain resort community, which is Aspen. And many of the people that I grew up with also are not living in our hometown. They're living in Silt, Rifle, Parachute, all distanced from the places where we grew up. I'm also very committed to our community and have had the opportunity and privilege of working for Colorado Mountain College for more than 15 years. And I have had the privilege of talking to and getting to meet and know all of our resort mountain towns and seeing that my experiences with housing are similar, and in some cases they're much more extreme cases of housing all across our mountain resort community. So I wanted to bring a lens that particularly is not offered in typical housing research and really bring the voices of those individuals in our mountain resort communities that are often underrepresented. I'm going to pass it along to my colleagues who can share a little bit about themselves and the approach that they took to the work.
Hi, I'm Zachary Haberler. I'm the Manager of Strategic Analytics at Colorado Mountain College. I've been in the Roaring Fork Valley for 8 years, beginning when I started employment at the college. And as the quantitative data analysis person on this, that was my primary role, and perspective was wanting to get a better sense of what data is being collected, how is it being used by different housing authorities in our region as it relates to affordable housing, and with a particular optics on affordability in relation to our cost of living.
Hello, everybody. Just absolutely thrilled to be here and to share more about our research. My name is Sara Walsh. At the time we started this project, I was on the team with Yesenia and Zach at Colorado Mountain College, working in strategic initiatives. I have since transitioned to doing independent consulting, really focused on capital planning, operational efficiency, and real estate for public sector organizations. My background is as a corporate attorney, and I've managed public sector real estate on the Front Range for over a decade, and now for the last 2 years have been living in Chaffee County, Colorado. Having worked in public education, housing, and now I do a lot of work in disability advocacy as well, I think what I've realized is that the common thread is that I like hard challenges, and certainly housing in high-cost recreation-dependent areas is a nut that no one seems to have cracked yet. We are trying things. I think there's a broad coalition, including the people on this webinar, who care a lot about this, but I don't think anyone would say, I've got the solution to this. I know what works. And so we are really tackling this from a sort of lens of what work has been done already, what has been the impact of that work, and how can we think of outside the box and bring a new perspective to this conversation around housing.
Speaking of different perspective, we want to talk a little bit of the approach that we took to this research. we wanted to first understand the landscape of housing solutions, and keeping in mind that housing for us, especially when we talk about economic mobility, is more than just a roof over someone's head. Access to housing also provides access to employment, to education, to a quality of life. So it's important for us to understand that our approach that we took was, how do we look at our region, and we'll talk about our region in a little bit, but understanding what are some of the housing solutions that are already being considered. For purposes of our research, we did not delve into employer-based affordable housing. Our affordable housing landscape work that we did was all on just public affordable housing governmental efforts. We also wanted to evaluate the economic impact of housing challenges, particularly on marginalized groups. When we talk about economic mobility, it's important to consider, well, who can benefit the most from access to housing and the ability to be economically mobile. We also wanted to assess the accessibility and the equity of current housing policies and programs that exist in our region. And we wanted to propose solutions that consider economic mobility as a factor. And to what Sara mentioned, is just add a very different perspective to the conversation that exists right now around housing, which tends to be on supply and demand mostly. And we wanted to lay the groundwork for a different approach in conversations about housing, and potentially equip decision makers on thinking about this different approach. And our research does highlight future research that can be followed up as a result of the ground that we have laid here. Housing plays a huge factor into economic mobility. And as I mentioned, is a critical factor in the foundation for individuals to access different aspects of their life, including community engagement and civic engagement. We wanted to identify which communities face a significant barrier to housing that lead to economic mobility, especially as it relates to home ownership, to affordable rentals. But we wanted to analyze this at the intersection of how these might limit the opportunities for long-term financial stability. And as my colleague will share a little bit of our region, we have to understand the wealth gap that exists. In the United States, housing is still a primary factor of how we build wealth, and therefore giving individuals and families the ability to become economically mobile. So for us, it's important to think about the research in terms of these factors and the ability to access and how this wealth gap might perpetuate economic inequities.
So, I think it's important to understand, like, I would guess a lot of people on this webinar are sort of steeped in the housing question and affordable housing discussions, and maybe have been for the last few years, maybe the last 5 or 10 years. But when you think about sort of the broader lens of public policy, the focus on affordable housing in rural communities is a relatively nascent body of work, right? It's something that, maybe some communities like Pitkin County or Summit County have been at it for 15, 20 years, but I think a lot of us are just really in the last 10 years starting to build a body of research and figure out, what does this actually mean to have a housing crisis in a rural community? The best academic body that we've found that is really trying to aggregate research on this topic is out of Utah State University. It's actually a collaboration between University of Utah and Utah State, and they have a NAR collective. So NAR stands for Gateway and Natural Amenity Regions. And they have a really great data-driven definition of what a NAR region is. And what we've found, and what the researchers that have worked with the NAR group have found, is that these regions really share similar characteristics. They have high property values, they have seasonal demand, and lack of available units for year-round residents. There's also some data around population size. So by and large, these are smaller population areas that have exorbitantly high housing costs. And sometimes there's access challenges, there's transportation challenges, And the reality of the labor markets involve high commute times and long transportation times. So what we found is that, and like I said, I worked in this field on the Front Range for a long time, and I see there's some Front Range folks here, which I really appreciate. But the challenges are a little bit different because, when you hear about the national, you hear about the national narrative around housing, it's all focused on supply. If we could just build enough supply, if we could just build enough units, then we wouldn't have an affordable housing challenge. But the problem when you apply that philosophy to a small rural community is twofold. One, a lot of our communities are genuinely land constrained, right? They're surrounded by sort of national forests or national parks or state forests. And I don't think people move to mountain communities to live next to skyscrapers, right? There is an aspect of wanting to preserve a rural quality of life. And sometimes those things can come into conflict. So I think what we realized and why this NAR body has been developed is because there really are unique challenges to these NAR regions. And so we took an approach that really took into account the unique considerations of our rural resort communities.
As you can see from this map, we interlaid it with Colorado Mountain College's service area. So our focus of our research is in the area of Steamboat Springs, and then in the counties in that central mountain region, with farthest western end of Colorado being Garfield County, and including Eagle County, Pitkin County, Lake County, Chaffee County, and then Summit County in there. And so any of that area where you see that shadowing are the areas where our research focused, and we will delve into our methodology that we'll use.
So we took a multiple methods approach to this research project, and we began initially by a broad scan of what is happening in our region across several counties here. Beginning with interviewing representatives from various housing authorities or towns that are engaged in housing, nonprofit organizations like Habitat for Humanity, for example. Looking at what programs are there, what are their strategies, what do they feel has worked, what doesn't work, what data do they collect, what are their processes, and scouring any websites that were available that have additional information about the programs that are in use, applications, any help materials, educational materials that are out there, things like that. And as part of that, we had initially hoped that we would see more data from the organizations themselves, so that we could help evaluate affordable housing, who's accessing it, what are the success rates, what's sort of an application to yield rate, average time on a wait list, things like that were sort of our dream data points when we started. And we very quickly realized in our interview process that a lot of that data is actually housed and controlled by local property management companies. It's not that is only happening, but it's a predominant practice. And so it became, a logistical challenge to try to wrangle and get all of that data. So we pivoted our direction a little bit from our plan and ended up looking at cost of living data as another way of assessing, the context, but also, how well do affordable housing programs meet cost of living needs? How do those match up? And so there are a few different ways you can pull a lot of this type of cost of living data together. Family budget calculator is what I ended up using, but there's also sources from Massachusetts Institute of Technology has one as well. Kind of a cost of living budget calculator in a similar way. But it pulls together housing data, child care, food costs, transportation, healthcare, utilities, those kinds of costs. And you can see that by county, you can see that by family size type. So I pulled that in, and I also pulled in a lot of labor market data from Lighthouse, which is a company that develops their own system of pulling together some data that is governmental data, similar to what I've pulled, but one of the key things that we used for this was a job posting database that they maintain. So basically they have a system that crawls the internet, looks for job postings on all of the major websites you can think of, and organizes it by county and by occupational code, and you can get a lot of optics into data that way. So I pulled that type of data at the county level to assess labor market levels by county, and we'll look in a little bit later what sort of data that actually ends up yielding. But that's what we did on the quantitative side.
That initial data set informed how we were going to move ahead with the qualitative study. We knew we wanted to delve deep into talking to residents of affordable housing, who is using them, or maybe people who were on waiting lists, but because we did not have access to those, we pivoted and did a regional qualitative study that focused on a survey that was launched in English and Spanish, with the focus areas being housing affordability and impact. We asked individuals where they lived and where their work was, where they worked. We asked how much it was costing them for where they were living, how many people in their household. So we got a lot of detailed information. We received over 420 responses, being representative of all of the counties that we mentioned. Individuals who answered the survey then had the opportunity of doing an in-depth interview with the researchers, whether it was myself or my assistant researcher, and all of the surveys were held anonymously. In addition, we reached out to the different communities and trusted community leaders that work in either public space or nonprofit space to identify both their personal housing experience, but also their professional experience in working with others in finding affordable housing in their communities. To protect the identity of everyone. Everybody has remained anonymous, and that was part of what we communicated to make sure that we received honest responses and gave us a clear example of the situation, especially related to accessing affordable housing projects. So this survey was over the course of the summer months, and then follow-up interviews were in the subsequent months leading to the end of the year. We're going to move on to some key findings.
Yeah, and thanks, Yesenia. I just kind of want to emphasize what Zach and Yesenia touched on in terms of the pivot that we had to make, because it actually is really important to one of our key findings.
Okay.
I think when we went into this project, we thought we would get a bunch of really great data from all the housing agencies with here's who's lived in our units, here's how that's changed over time, here's their race, here's their ethnicity, here's their income, here's their household size. Like, I think we had dreams of getting these beautiful spreadsheets that we could then analyze and look at changes over time. Quickly learned that was not going to happen for a couple of reasons. Very few organizations have good centralized systems to track that kind of data. And if they do track the data, it lies, like Zach mentioned, with individual property managers who have no incentive to work with us, who are private organizations whose job is to fill units. That's a challenge. So, I think one of the things we'll talk about a lot today is that without that data, it is almost impossible to evaluate the effectiveness of affordable housing programs. Working in public policy, one of the first things that we talk about is evaluation. If you run a nonprofit and you raise money, the first thing a funder is going to want is an impact report. How do they know that their money is going towards something that is doing what they said they were going to do? So I think, that's the direction we'd like to see folks go. But in the meantime, we sort of worked with the data that we had. And what we found is that there is a huge disconnect in our Latinx communities between the programs that are out there and access and knowledge of those programs. Our Latinx communities are primarily renters. There's a lot of overcrowding, a lot of shared living spaces that takes a toll on lots of other indicators of mental and physical well-being, and Yesenia will get more into that. And, the reason we called this project From Surviving to Thriving is that what we found is that the vast majority of programs that exist today are really just focused on surviving. They're focused on getting a roof over people's heads without a clear look at total cost of living. Are people allowed to actually thrive, to build a middle-class lifestyle, to build intergenerational wealth? And are we actually moving the needle on any economic mobility indicators, right? Could we look back over the last 10 years and say, because, we're sitting in Breckenridge right now, because the town of Breckenridge has invested X number of dollars over the last 10 years in affordable housing, we have seen our Latinx communities grow their educational achievement, grow their home ownership rates, right? Like, that's the sort of data that we want to be able to see, and that just doesn't exist today. And with the programs that do exist, we see that they are not being accessed equitably. There are trust issues, there are language barriers. I mean, I just had an anecdote of a friend of mine that I saw yesterday in Salida, who I was encouraging her to look at the Chafee Housing Trust units. I see Chafee Housing Trust folks on this call, and she was like a deer in headlights, like totally overwhelmed by the process. And so we see that there's just like this informational and accessibility barrier. And then finally, what we've seen is that a lot of housing solutions are hyper localized right now. Like in one county, let's take Pitkin County, for example, you might have a county agency, you might have the town of Snowmass, you might have the city of Aspen, you might have the town of Basalt. So there's just a lot of agencies, there's a lot of applications, there's duplication of resources, there's higher overhead costs, and there's inability to scale without these larger collaboratives.
All right, so now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the data that I pulled and looked at. We could easily spend an entire series of webinars going through all of that. Many of you might be happy that we won't spend that much time today doing that, but so essentially what I did was I took the global cost of living numbers that were annual, so a certain amount of money per year for a baseline cost of living estimate by family type. And I paired that with our county level labor market data. So there are a couple of ways to do this. If I use new job postings, so let's say over a course of an entire year, what is the average job posting wage by county? That's usually a few thousand higher than a current, but the difference is not drastic. And in many of the counties in our area, the counties that are listed on this graph, for example, the average wage is going to be 52, 54, 56,000 a year, somewhere in that range. I took that number and kind of married it with the cost of living to come up with what is an estimate of the average number of jobs needed by a family to afford that cost of living, and laid that out by family type here. So on this graph, the blue is a one adult, no children family, so a single adult home, basically. One adult, two children is orange, green is two adult, two child, and red is two adult, four children. And obviously, as you go up the family size type, costs are going to escalate, especially childcare and healthcare costs are going to escalate. And so what we found is, the way things are right now, it takes, on average, many family types at least 2.5 and sometimes 3 or 4, as you see in Summit County, for the 2 adult, 4 children, 4 average incomes worth of income to afford that cost of living. And that, resonated with some of what we found in our survey as well, with when we asked them about their experience living here and the number of jobs they have. But that sort of helps contextualize a little bit the overall sort of mismatch between cost of living, labor markets, and then we're working in this housing space, particularly trying to make housing more affordable for those who need it most. I'll start this slide off because the next thing I did after doing that kind of average job analysis, this global cost of living analysis, is just as a thought exercise. I was like, what if I took housing and decreased the cost by 50%? Well, when I did that, many family types still needed additional income to meet cost of living, unless you were in the smallest. So individuals, obviously, they're going to be the best off in that scenario where housing is subsidized at 50%. But larger family types, because all of the other costs in addition to housing are what they are, additional income is still probably going to be a requirement to meet the cost of living numbers that we were looking at. And so that was one of our big aha moments of just sort of how big this cost of living elephant in the room is when we talk about housing, as it relates to affordability. Before I hand it off, I'll just emphasize that the data sources that I use for cost of living, the source for housing was 40th percentile rent estimates from HUD. And being 40th percentile, it's an estimate of what a family would pay at kind of this just below average number in terms of the overall spread of rent in a given county. I think that's a conservative estimate. And so when we ran certain analyses, evaluating the Good Deeds program, for example, that is underestimating what a lot of families are going to run up against when they're looking for housing. And so just keep that in mind as well, is that, there are certain conversations that are challenging because of what's available, what is available that's out there. So.
Yeah, I think to build on that, the next bullet point you see, like in extreme high cost locations, like Pickens County, Summit County, programs that, subsidize the cost of, like, even paying 30% of somebody's home costs, like that's incredible. That is an incredible program. But when your median home cost is $9 million, $11 million, that program doesn't work unless you can find properties that are below market value. And that already kind of comes up against the sort of surviving, not thriving, let's just put a roof over people's heads. And we'll kind of get into some recommendations here, but it's challenging, right? This is a sticky situation because if median home prices are so high, it's very hard to find housing stock, even if you're paying 30% of somebody's housing costs and they are making close to AMI. We talked about the data, and I saw the comment in the chat, April. That's a really great comment. Just an anecdote here, as part of the reason that the three of us got involved in this is because we were involved in CMC's rollout of housing units. We worked really closely with our general counsel to talk through, like, what can we legally be doing in this world to sort of bring an equity lens and a better data tracking lens into what we do. And I'm not going to provide legal advice on this webinar, but there are ways to get the data. You can't ask people for certain demographic information and make housing decisions based on that information, but you can collect data on people once they're in a program. And some of the larger consortiums like Habitat for Humanity, et cetera, they do have better data tracking systems in place. So there are limitations legally, but it is possible. And having worked in other sectors where there's sort of data privacy concerns, like higher ed, like public education, there's a lot you can do on the back end. And I think we found the challenge actually in talking to people was not so much in sort of the legal hurdles. It was much more in sort of the systems hurdles. Lack of staff capacity, lack of a centralized system, highly localized solutions, the use of property managers. All of that was really what was inhibiting the centralized collection of data, which is absolutely critical to evaluate impact. I think there's a little bit of a financial stewardship argument too, where, if taxpayer dollars are going towards housing programs, like, I want to know if those programs are being effective. And we could not, we've had such a hard time really finding any information or research out there that said, yes, we know these programs are being effective. because of X, Y, and Z, because we've seen educational attainment improve. We've seen mobility decrease, or we've seen, home ownership rates increase, things like that. That data just wasn't available, which is, concerning for such a high dollar, a program that's so expensive. Housing is expensive. You're talking about building buildings. So, as a taxpayer, I really want to know, are these programs being effective? And again, like we talked about, having those highly localized solutions not only leads to inefficiencies, but it's confusing. It's complex. Yesenia talked in her interviews and surveys to people who were like, I live and work one place. I live in Garfield County. I work in Pickens County. My kid goes to school somewhere else. Where do I even apply? Like, who do I go to? Investing in positions like housing navigators, and things like that at the workforce, employers having housing navigators, things like that, to really help people navigate all the different systems is really critical. I'll pass it over to Yesenia to talk about the mobile homes.
Yeah, in our qualitative study, it was very clear and apparent that mobile homes and mobile home parks have been a long time vital source of affordable housing for our rural resort mountain communities. And in just one quarter alone, there could be up to 50 mobile home parks, and most of those are at the jeopardy of being non-existent because some of them have been replaced. They're privately owned and they can come in, and so it's crucial to definitely protect and preserve the quality of life also that exists in mobile home parks. And we understand and know that in Colorado, legislation and proactive measures have been done to protect or offer some type of protection, whether it's the quality of water in mobile home parks or the quality of energy efficiencies extended to mobile home park owners. But these end up being still very vulnerable places that in Summit County, for example, there's been mobile homes that have displaced entire families out of the region and out of the state, which are individuals who played a vital labor force in our mountain resort communities. Part of this is how can we see more of local municipalities in being that essential on safeguarding these communities. And our report, by the way, which will be published on the Bell Policy website very soon, you can find the detailed findings of both the quantitative and the qualitative, but I wanted to lift up some of the narratives and the stories to combine it with a quantitative. We spoke to a single mother who has 2 children and works 2 jobs in Summit County in the hospitality sector, and she rents a small apartment 50 miles from her workplace because it's the only affordable option. Wakes up very early in the morning to prepare the kids to go to school, and working 60 hours a week, and despite that, her income barely is able to cover the cost of rent, which is where most and the majority of the costs go, and the rest going to transportation and food. Her dreams of owning a home really are far-reaching because saving particularly for a down payment is not possible. And her situation really highlights how limited affordable housing near job centers really forces families into different commutes and affecting their quality of life and their economic mobility. And this is what we saw once and once again throughout a lot of the narratives, is that speaking to folks around affordable housing, it was very clear within minutes of whether it was a conversation that there were other challenges and issues that they were sharing, whether they had to make the choice from going to the doctor or paying rent. So the vulnerability that people have in access to health, or the mental health stress that it creates, like in the case of the couple who lives in Eagle County with their 3 children and 2 extended family members. And they share a 2-bedroom apartment to make rent manageable. And these are probably one of the less severe scenarios that we heard. We heard of individuals living 16 people in a small place. We heard stories from teachers of people living under the skirting of mobile homes in just very, very dire conditions. For this couple in particular, privacy is just a luxury that they don't have. Overcrowding is really taking a toll on the mental health and the stress and the conflict. When we spoke to community leaders, especially community leaders that work in the mental health space, part of the most recent studies that are coming up with youth, particularly in Eagle County, a lot of overlap to youth housing situations come up. Final story on here is about a construction worker in Eagle County who heard about the local affordable housing programs, but really struggled to understand the application process, which was only available in English. And despite websites saying that Spanish would soon come, the programs roll out, and he was left without the opportunity to participate. But a lot of these stories that we heard about, I don't think we have affordable housing programs in our county, or yeah, I've heard about it, but honestly, it's very complex, to leaders in the community who may work in one sphere, in one sector, and having to try to explain to someone and help them out with all of the paperwork that exists. So all to summarize that, people feel like there isn't anything there, and then when there is, it's very, very cumbersome, including counties who have done many efforts to try to reach to our Latino community. More stories that we can highlight on here, that I just want to highlight the themes. The fact that people are having to move several times and not finding that stability, and what that is that doing to some of the educational challenges and some of the challenges in development and well-being for children. And I think at this point of the research is where we started to find out that housing, and especially affordable housing, cannot be an issue that is solved within itself. That any affordable housing project has to include and be multi-systemic and multi-issue for it to be successful and impactful, given that there's a limited amount of resources that can be invested in affordable housing, and there's a huge demand. Because of the absence of bilingual outreach that even community leaders would speak, given that they're well known in the community, they're well connected, and that they themselves didn't understand, gave us a glimpse that yes, these affordable housing projects might be very scarce, and there might be shyness to put it out there and broadly because there's not going to be enough for everyone. Really should not be that deterrent to assuring that these programs are well outreached so that individuals who really need it, and that there is the help to facilitate the process. Often property management companies are left to help individuals with the process, but they're not interested in helping. They are there to mostly have the process, and they have no incentive necessarily to be outreach. And finally, the last example here explains even the impact on business owners who are worried about how they're going to keep employees. And this is all about talent and talent workforce. And for us at Colorado Mountain College, of course, this is important, right? And how does talent workforce and the growing of our own, or how do we keep our workers, is an essential part of the conversation. Here are some quotes that encapsulate how difficult it is for economic mobility to be a reality in the midst of this affordable housing topic and conversation. It's impossible to save for a down payment, and it's really inaccessible, this information that is out there. So what we're left with is in aging, overcrowded homes, really, because there's no other alternative. And the alternatives that in some communities, like in Lake County, individuals are opting out of leaving the area entirely. And of course, that has an impact in our schools, in our jobs, in our workplaces, because we have to replace that talent.
Yeah, so part of what we wanted to do with this research was first sort of understand, like, what are the solutions that are out there today? We wanted to sort of define the box that people have been working within over the last, 10 to 15 years. I'm a big believer in the philosophy that you have to both work better within the world that exists today, and you have to change the world, and you have to do them at the same time. So I think there's an aspect of what are the solutions that are out there today, and can we do a little bit of a better job in administering and being more thoughtful about those solutions? So we have this acronym, DEAL, we call it the DEAL framework, that sort of summarizes all the different solutions that are commonly being used today to tackle affordable housing. The first category are sort of deed restrictions and development-driven strategies. At its most fundamental level, all this means is that an agency, a nonprofit, an employer is buying or building units specifically to preserve them in the affordable housing market. So that could mean that they're paying, there's a buy down program where they're paying for a deed restriction on an existing unit, or maybe they're buying land to build new units. But it just means they're trying to address the sort of supply side of the equation. The next category, the education and support services, this is really like the wraparound services. There are agencies and nonprofits that really just focus on educating first-time homebuyers, kind of financing 101. A lot of organizations require some sort of education before you participate in their programs. I think my experience sort of delving into those materials is that a lot of that is somewhat compliance focused, maybe not as engaging or tailored to specific audiences as it could be. Again, much of that is because of staff and funding limitations. The next category is assistance with rent or down payment. This is just an organization gives some individual money, security deposit, first and last month's rent, or to help with the down payment. On the rental side, this is often focused on immediate stabilization. If you've been in the housing world for a while, I'm sure you've seen sort of the spectrum of housing from like people experiencing homelessness all the way to home ownership, and there are lots of steps in the middle. And then the last one, which I think, and I'll actually touch on the comment on AMI and the Q&A in this, and we'll talk about that more, but this is really where I think we can build our collective power to make local code changes, land use code, short-term rental restrictions, all of those things that can have a more sustainable, lasting impact, and lobbying at the state level, federal level. I won't get into this week because I think that's gotten complicated, but at the state level, lobbying for more flexible funding mechanisms. I think the three of us are the champion of the anti-AMI committee, to your comment from the anonymous person. AMI is not a good tool, but it is ubiquitous. Any grant program that you're going to go through that comes from federal dollars or Department of Housing dollars, you're going to have to deal in the AMI box. The reason why we chose to look at total cost of living is exactly what I think this comment is getting at, right? Like AMI is not a good indicator of what it takes to actually live in a place. So total cost of living is a much better indicator because it allows you to subsidize housing at a rate that allows people to meet total cost of living without having to work multiple jobs. And that could change, right? That's going to change based on your income. AMI is just this really sort of binary metric that doesn't accommodate the reality of and the uniqueness of rural resort communities. The other thing we found with legislative funding opportunities is that they're highly inflexible. We at CMC were working on a grant-funded housing project in Eagle County, and we hit a brick wall because they quickly told us any units that are funded through this program have to be available to the general public. You can't prioritize your own staff or your own students. No employer on the planet is going to put their money into housing if they cannot use it, if they cannot prioritize their own staff, right? So in our rural communities, these partnerships, especially with large employers, are really critical. And we found that the existing funding mechanisms are just not, they're just too inflexible for that context. So we want to kind of wrap this up before we go into the Q&A with a little bit of like, what can we do? I know it's very easy to point out problems. I worked on the government side for many years, and my pet peeve was when people came and yelled at me at community meetings with problems but never brought solutions. So we vowed to not do that. We want to collaborate with everybody. We know everyone on this webinar and everyone working in housing cares a lot about what they do, and they want to do the best job they can with limited resources. So our goal is to hopefully provide some tools to help support that. So let's say you've gotten some funding through Prop 123, or you've gotten a ballot measure passed that gives you a pot of money to create new affordable housing programs. The first thing that you want to do is think about who do you want to provide housing for and why. So building that like philosophical vision at the forefront is really critical. We found that a lot of housing programs are a bit opportunistic. It's sort of like, oh, there's units available. We have this money. Let's just go buy units. I think we would encourage everyone to sort of pause and think about who you want to provide housing for and why. Why do you care about it? And then build data systems to be able to monitor that impact. All good public policy should have an evaluation component. So making sure that you are able to effectively track and measure the impact of your policies. And this is going to be long-term, right? Like housing, getting a stable housing isn't going to change somebody's immediate economic mobility, right? These are going to have to be longitudinal studies. And we, as we talked about, really focusing on that total cost of living allows you to be more flexible, to bring those housing subsidies to a level that actually allows people to thrive, not just have a roof over their head. And then finally, really focusing on regional collaboration and multi-solution investments. If you think about cost of living, there's all those levers that Zach mentioned. There's housing, there's childcare, there's transportation, there's food, and then there's the other side of the equation, which are wages. In order to get people to a place of thriving, you have to increase wages or decrease cost of living or do both. So I think thinking about, is there a housing solution that provides free childcare? Is there a housing solution that minimizes transportation costs? Can we work on a countywide basis? Because we know that some of our employees, somebody who works in Aspen probably might not live in Aspen, right? So how are we collaborating? I think we've seen some collaborative organizations pop up, which is awesome. I think that's really the future of effective housing policy. And then once you have your incredible program set up, you've been thoughtful about who you're serving, you've got the right data tracking measures in place, how are you marketing it? How are you being intentional about outreaching communities, meeting communities where they are? I mean, at a base level, we've found housing websites that are not even available in multiple languages. We've found materials that are only available in English. So there's some sort of real basic translation things, all the way up to the heavily culturally competent, deep community engagement, leveraging partners who live and work in communities that you're trying to target. And then finally, how do we make sure that these programs are sustainable? And that's really where that legislative lobbying comes in. So making sure that grant opportunities are flexible, that they meet rural community needs, and that we're sort of collaborating. We just gave a presentation to the Colorado Association of Ski Towns, and somebody said, sometimes the municipalities don't have the same philosophy, and that can be a challenge. But I do think at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want if you live in a mountain community, you care a lot about sense of place. You care about the place that you live, and you want to see it shine. You want business owners to have employees. You want people to walk around feeling like they are invested in the place and that they love this place. And so I think at the end of the day, there is common ground. And if we could find that common ground to be able to lobby for sustainable funding streams, that will go a long way for the future of affordable housing policies. Anything you two want to add before we go to Q&A?
Not at the moment. I mean, for time purposes, we'll go to Q&A. I will remind folks that the full report will be available at the Ballot Policy website. And we're also happy to answer more localized questions as well. This presentation of today was a global overview of all of our research and our findings and encompassed all of the region. So some places might be a little bit more nuanced, but we're happy to talk further in a separate time. I'll stop sharing if it's okay, and we can move to question and answer. And Sarah, do you have the question and answer
The
there?
only one in the Q&A was the question about AMI. Zach, do you want to touch on that a little bit more about how I think you've been sort of in the AMI world the deepest and sort of maybe what are some alternatives to that?
Sure. I mean, to reiterate the comment I left in the chat as well, when we were talking to folks on the ground doing this work every day, AMI was the bane of everyone's existence. Nobody likes it. There are questions about it, and I think they're very relevant, and I think there's even potentially some disconnect between AMI that's calculated and derived from census data versus what maybe our raw labor market data is showing us is the labor market realities, and that's one of the reasons why we went the direction we did, was to try to dig into that question of, well, how well do an average job is sort of how I ended up framing it for myself, but the income levels versus the cost of living data that we are seeing that incorporate things like childcare, healthcare, transportation, knowing that there are certain realities in rural communities, that there are trade-offs. Like, sure, you can live down valley and commute, but now your transportation costs are higher too annually. So some of the savings that you might get from housing discounts are going to go elsewhere potentially, to say nothing of things that are sort of unspent costs, the kind of silent costs, additional wear and tear on yourself, driving longer every day, waking up earlier every day, having longer days, those kinds of things on top of additional employment. So I think the finding out better ways to use the data that we have available to us that get at that cross section of income versus cost of living, that is not simply this very almost sort of clunky threshold system that we have now. I definitely think there's a lot of room and hope, I think, but we also recognize the frustration that, like, if you're federally funded, you feel compelled to follow that guidance, and without any other guidance that is well established out there, AMI fills this space of convenience for people to use. So I think that furthering these conversations, digging into the data that we have available to us, the types of cross-sectional data tools that I kind of built for our own research, we could work with communities for sure, developing that kind of insight for themselves and having those conversations together as a community.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, in terms of the question on, like, is there a specific AMI level? Because we're sort of stuck with that for now. I mean, I think the answer is it depends. And I will offer up, like, our help. We would love to continue to be involved. I think another question was ongoing research. We have a long list of additional research questions we'd love to dig into. We all have full-time jobs. We sort of did this as a nights and weekends thing because we're passionate about it and we care about it and we live in mountain communities. But we are actively sort of trying to figure out what some follow-up research would look like, because there is just so much to be done on this topic. It is definitely like peeling the layers of an onion. And yeah, the thinking outside the box, I think that's what we're trying to push, right? Like, I'm sure all of you have seen a housing needs assessment for your municipalities, and that's great. That's an important piece of data. But I always compare that to talking about the national debt ceiling. It doesn't really mean anything. It's like saying you need $1 trillion, saying a town of 10,000 people needs 7,000 additional units. Like, that's not helpful. If I'm a policymaker, decision maker, I'm like, what do I do with that information? So our goal is really to, like, kind of go around just the supply and demand conversation, and to think outside the box, get people to collaborate on things, start thinking about housing solutions that incorporate other huge, aspects of people's lives that really impact their cost of living. And yes, you will, if you are using federal dollars, you will still be stuck dealing in AMI.
Unless we change the laws.
Unless we change the laws, which is not out of the realm. So appreciate all the comments. Let me see. I know there was a question in the chat, Reed, about sort of limitations on using funding for employee staff. I'm not totally sure the context of that, but yeah, I mean, certainly there's nuance. A question came up in our earlier presentation this morning about like, isn't there a downside of time? You know, if you talk about employer provided housing, isn't there a downside to linking somebody's job to their housing? And that is absolutely valid. I shared the anecdote that I managed real estate and sort of strategic projects for Denver Public Schools for many years. And we tried to do a teacher housing project back in 2017 that just got crushed by teachers and the teachers union because they, you know, validly said, just pay us more. We don't want our employer to be our landlord. You should just pay us more so that we can afford housing, right? So that's a totally valid argument. I have heard they have since come around, but I think I would argue that there is a role for employers to play, particularly given our mountain context, and particularly given the fact that there's a handful of large employers in our regions, and it feels like we can all work together to find an interesting, innovative solution. If it's going to happen anywhere, I do believe it can happen in a rural resort community. A couple other questions in the chat. I'm just reading the one about mixed income streets and neighbors. Curious if there are solid examples of mixed income streets and neighborhoods where zoning isn't as strict instead of what we know as income segregation, where folks are thriving in mixed income streets and neighborhoods in rural Colorado resort towns and cities or in other states. I have two thoughts on that, and I'll let Yesenia and Zach chime in. First, when I was working for Denver Public Schools, we did a really extensive research project on school segregation, and we did a kind of a meta-analysis of the research that was out there, and the data was really clear, at least for educational outcomes, that mixed income, that concentrations of poverty are what was the most damaging to student outcomes, and that mixed income neighborhoods, there's a lot of research that that is the most effective affordable housing strategy. I think that takes on an interesting context. I will say, my anecdote, as I live in a newer neighborhood in Salida, directly across the street from a Chafee Housing Trust property. We built our house. It's market rate. There's lots of market rate houses, and then there's lots of housing trust units that are income restricted in our neighborhood. I think it is beautiful. It's one of the reasons I bought a plot in that neighborhood. So I do think it's possible. And the other thing is, this came up this morning too, is like along our mountain towns, you have an old mining shack next to a $6 million house, and people are okay with that. That's just how we live. So I think it's possible. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, although our research didn't necessarily delve into that, I think it could be a really great extension of our research, right? Especially in our findings of, who lives where, through the qualitative study, when I would ask, like, do you live in an apartment? Do you live in a housing? And it was interesting, depending on that community, that they would even say, yeah, I live in Little Managua, or I live in, this mobile home park, and this sense of who tends to live there, right? And what type of living conditions, and then what they have access to. But I think that it doesn't steer away from the fact that, especially in our region, mobile home parks have traditionally been affordable housing, and yet the protections there don't exist, and the quality of life isn't there. And so what traditional municipalities have been doing, it's like, let's go away with the mobile home park and let's build some other type of affordable housing, but it's affordable for whom? Who is the priority here in terms of who is the labor market? And to Sarah's point, I think having that clear philosophical approach from the beginning to the evaluation to the implementation has been one of the key learnings for us. I want to stay cognizant of time, so I will lean on my folks and my friends at the Bell Policy who are helping us with today's webinar, and I want to get a flag from them on where we are with time in case there's more questions.
I think we have two more, one follow-up and one more.
Okay.
Are we good?
Can we answer one more question, friends? I'll take that as a yes.
Okay. I'll real quick address the follow-up comment. Thanks for that, Reed. That helps me clarify what you were asking. Yeah, so I think the example that we found challenging was that, like, so for example, with CMC, we were initially looking to partner with other employers in Eagle County, like Vail Health, for example, where we would all come together and apply for a grant. And that was when we said, this is not going to work. We cannot use these grant funds because this is all targeted, prioritized employer housing. That was what we were told by the Department of Housing. And then sort of the size got reduced. Well, they said, okay, well, you can use the grant funds for the units that are available to the general public. But then the grant just kept getting reduced and reduced, and the compliance and paperwork burden was so high, even for an organization like CMC that has a dedicated grant team and in-house lawyers. I mean, it was a beast of a project. And the number of grant funded units, was so low that sort of the cost benefit trade-off just like kept getting whittled down, which just goes to like the inflexible funding mechanisms. And then the question from Jonathan, I love this question because we have been talking about ways to measure economic mobility that really don't exist today, like educational attainment, because we don't have the data. And what you're bringing up is like, what about quality of life, not just home ownership rates and educational attainment? That is a fantastic idea, right? Like, let's layer that into our data structures at the jump. Like, let's have people fill out surveys when they're enrolling to go live in a new unit about their mental health, about quality of life, and then let's survey them every year. Like, that's a great idea. I love that.
Yeah, I think there are other, aspects of like building in on the front end as we think about building a better data system, which, by the way, we did provide in our report a template of potential data points that could be included to at least start monitoring. We didn't necessarily go towards the mental health quality of life side, but you could certainly track and monitor, some basic things like, how long are you traveling to work over time? Does that improve? Maybe you would hope overall that your metrics improve as a housing authority or as a community, for example, as you move forward with some of your work. But there are a lot of things like that. My recommendation in general would be to build them in at the point of application or the point of occupancy, so that you have a sort of baseline of where you're starting that you can start working with.
Well, we have run out of time for today, and as you can tell, we're pretty passionate about this topic, especially after being in this research for a year. And we want to thank everyone who's equally passionate about this topic for your participation, for listening, for engaging with us. Thank you so much for attending this. This recording of this webinar will be available on Bell Policy's website. We invite you to share with others and to visit the Bell Policy website also for our full report. And we're also happy to continue the conversation in our insights and the collaboration. We hope that we have brought in a different perspective and things that are quite different to consider as we're thinking about the affordable housing solutions. And our report does include future recommendations for future research. So for those researchers out there, if you're interested in continuing the work, especially as it relates to rural resort communities, we live in a data desert. We live in deserts that do not have enough information that apply to us in our unique circumstances. So we invite you to continue on the research. Anything else, team?
No, just thank you. We're grateful for all your time. We're always happy to connect individually. You should have our contact info. If not, let the Bell folks know. We'll share it, and they should have the report up pretty soon. I think they're just putting the final touches on it. So we're just grateful to be here and hope this is the beginning of a long conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.